Marcus Webb had learned a long time ago that the heater in his apartment only worked if you talked to it right. You had to give it a minute, let it rattle and cough like an old man clearing his throat, and only then would it decide to blow warm air instead of cold. Tonight it was taking longer than usual. He sat on the edge of Maya's bed anyway, waiting it out, running his thumb along the frayed edge of her blanket while she fought to keep her eyes open. "Daddy, is the heater sick again?" "Just a little tired," he said. "Like you should be." "I'm not tired." She was asleep 4 minutes later, one hand curled around the stuffed rabbit that had lost most of its fur years before she was even born, passed down from a cousin who didn't want it anymore. Marcus sat there a while longer, the way he always did, watching her chest rise and fall, memorizing the sound of it. It was the only part of his day that ever felt like it was actually his. He closed her door most of the way, leaving the usual 3 inches so the hallway light could reach in if she woke up scared, and walked to the kitchen table where the bills were waiting for him like they always were, spread out under the one working bulb in a XCD pattern only he understood. Past due. Past due. Final notice. He sat down slow, like the chair might not hold him if he moved too fast, and put his head in his hands for exactly as long as he allowed himself, which was never very long. 30 seconds. A minute at most. Then he sat up, because sitting there feeling it wouldn't pay for anything, and started sorting them by how much trouble they'd cause him if he didn't pay them this week versus next. He was 29 years old and he had already stopped remembering what it felt like to not be tired. There had been a version of his life once where things looked different. A version with 2 incomes instead of 1, with a woman who used to sing off-key in the kitchen while she cooked, before she decided that motherhood and the life that came with it weren't things she wanted after all. He didn't think about that much anymore. There wasn't room for it. Every hour of every day was already accounted for: work, Maya, sleep, work again, and somewhere in the cracks between those things he was supposed to find the energy to also be a good father, which was the only job on the list he actually cared about doing well. He finished sorting the bills, stacked them by urgency, and turned off the kitchen light. Tomorrow he'd figure out which ones could wait another week. Tonight he just needed to sleep, because the shift at the hotel started at 4 and there was no calling in sick when you were the only income in the house. By 8 that night he was standing outside the Whitfield Grand in a downpour that had turned the sidewalk into a river, wearing a red vest that fit him wrong in the shoulders and holding an umbrella over a woman in a mink coat who didn't say thank you. Water came off the awning in sheets. Behind the glass doors, gold light spilled out onto the wet pavement, and if he leaned his head just slightly he could hear it, a low murmur of laughter, the clink of glasses, a jazz quartet playing something slow and expensive. He'd never once been inside as anything other than staff. He handed the woman her ticket stub, jogged out into the storm to bring around a car worth more than he'd make in 4 years, and did it again. And again. Thunder cracked somewhere over the bay. He didn't flinch. He'd stopped flinching at things like that a long time ago. The other valets complained about nights like this, the cold, the wet, the way the leather soles of their shoes never fully dried out before the next shift started, but Marcus had stopped complaining about weather sometime around his second winter on the job. Complaining took energy he didn't have to spare. He'd learned to let the rain be rain, to let his shoulders ache the way they always ached by hour 6, to nod politely at guests who never once looked him in the eye long enough to notice he had won. There was a particular kind of invisibility that came with wearing a uniform like his, standing in doorways like his, and most nights he didn't think about it at all. It was just the shape of his life. Tonight, though, something about the storm made him feel it more than usual, the gap between the warmth spilling out through the glass doors and the cold soaking through his jacket, 2 entirely different worlds separated by 4 inches of tempered glass. Around 11, when the crowd had thinned to the late stragglers and the doormen were starting to check their watches, a commotion broke out near the entrance. A woman's voice, sharp as glass, cutting straight through the sound of the rain. "Don't you dare tell me how to feel about this, Julian. Don't you dare." Marcus kept his eyes forward, the way he'd trained himself to, but he could see them in the corner of his vision. A tall man in a tailored coat, jaw tight, trying to keep his voice down in that particular way rich people did when they wanted to yell without looking like they were yelling. And a woman across from him, dark hair soaked through, her eyes bright with something that looked like it had been building for a long time. "You're being dramatic," the man said. "I'm being honest, which I realize is a foreign concept to you." She yanked something off her hand, and for a second the porch light caught it, a flash so bright it looked almost unnatural, like a small star had fallen out of the sky, and then she hurled it into the dark, off toward the hedges lining the far side of the drive, and turned on her heel. A car door slammed. Tires screamed against wet asphalt. The man swore under his breath and stormed back inside without a glance at anyone, least of all the valet standing soaked to the bone by the entrance. Marcus waited until the lobby had cleared before he went looking. He told himself it was because it was his job to keep the grounds clean, that someone could trip on broken glass or a lost earring in the dark, that it was simple diligence and nothing more. It took him almost 10 minutes on his hands and knees in the mud, flashlight from his phone cutting a small circle in the rain, before his fingers closed around something cold and impossibly heavy for its size. He stood up slowly and turned it over in his palm. The stone alone was the size of his thumbnail, cut in a way that seemed to pull every scrap of light from the street lamp above and throw it back tenfold. He'd never held anything like it. He'd never been near anything like it. For a moment he just stood there in the rain, letting the water run down the back of his collar, staring at a piece of jewelry that was worth more than every apartment he had ever lived in combined. He put it in his pocket and finished his shift like nothing had happened, though his hand kept drifting to it every few minutes, checking it was still there, half convinced he'd imagined the whole thing. 2 more cars came and went before his replacement showed up for the overnight shift. He clocked out, said his usual quiet goodnight to the night manager, and walked to the employee lot with his collar turned up against the rain, the small weight in his pocket somehow heavier than anything he'd ever carried. The truck's engine sputtered twice before it caught, same as always, and Marcus sat in the driver's seat with the ring resting in his open palm on the passenger seat, rain drumming on the roof like something with a pulse. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, steady and loud, the way it got sometimes late at night when the bills refused to leave his head. $10 million. He didn't know that yet, not the exact number, not until later, but he knew enough. He knew it was more money than he would make in 10 lifetimes doing what he did. He reached over and flipped down the sun visor, where a photograph was tucked into the elastic band, curled at the corners from being handled too many times. Maya at 4 years old, gap-toothed and grinning, standing on the sidewalk outside their old building in shoes that were 2 sizes too small because that was what they could afford that winter, the toes stuffed with newspaper so she could still walk in them without her feet sliding forward. He looked at the ring. He looked at the photograph. He sat there a long time, longer than he needed to, because some decisions announce themselves the second they arrive and this one had. He just needed a minute to be angry about it first, to resent how easy it would have been to make a different choice, before he let the truth settle into his chest and stay there. He wasn't going to be a man his daughter had to explain to people someday. Whatever else happened to them, whatever they lost, they weren't going to lose that. He thought about all the things $10 million could buy, turning them over one by one like he was window shopping a life he'd never get to live. A house with a real yard. A car that started every time without having to be talked into it. College, someday, without the word loans attached to it. A doctor's visit that didn't come with a follow-up bill that took 18 months to pay off. He let himself imagine it for exactly as long as it took to drive 2 blocks, and then he put it away, because the imagining wasn't going to change what he already knew about himself. Some things, once you did them, you couldn't undo. He wasn't willing to find out what kind of man he'd become on the other side of a decision like that. He pulled out of the lot and drove east, toward the part of the city where the buildings got taller and colder looking, and didn't stop until he found a directory that told him exactly whose name belonged to a stone like that. The lobby of Ashcombe Holdings had the kind of silence that money buys, no traffic noise, no hum of old pipes, just the soft click of his boots against marble so polished he could see the ceiling lights reflected in it. A security guard moved to intercept him before he'd made it 10 feet, hand already reaching for his radio, and Marcus didn't break stride. I need to see Victoria Ashcombe. Sir, you can't just. Tell her I found something of hers last night at the Whitfield Grand. Something in the way he said it, flat, unhurried, a man with nowhere else to be and nothing to prove, made the guard pause long enough to actually radio it up instead of throwing him out. 10 minutes later Marcus was standing in an office on the 31st floor that was larger than his entire apartment, facing a wall of glass that looked out over half the city, and a desk so vast and so clean it seemed less like furniture and more like a boundary line. Victoria Ashcombe stood behind it in a blazer that probably cost more than his truck, arms crossed, studying him the way she might study a stranger who'd wandered into the wrong building. He recognized her voice before he recognized her face. The woman from the rain. He didn't sit down, because she hadn't offered, and he didn't waste time on pleasantries she clearly wasn't interested in either. He reached into his jacket pocket, set the ring gently on the glass surface of her desk, and stepped back. For a moment she didn't move at all. Then her eyes flicked from the ring to him and back again, like she was waiting for the trick, the catch, the part where he asked for something. How much do you want for it, she said. It wasn't a question so much as a formality, the way you'd ask someone what time it was. Nothing. Everyone wants something. I don't. She studied him a moment longer, something sharp and unreadable moving behind her eyes, then reached for a checkbook in the top drawer of her desk without breaking eye contact, already writing before she spoke again. Then let's call it a reward. People like being rewarded. 50,000 should. I said nothing. He kept his voice even, no heat in it, just fact. I don't need your money, and I'm not interested in what you think I should be grateful for. I found something that belonged to you. I gave it back. That's the whole story. He turned and walked out before she could say another word, leaving her standing at her desk with a pen still in her hand and a check made out to a name she didn't even know, staring at the door long after it had closed behind him. She sat down slowly, the ring back in her possession but somehow feeling less like hers than it had that morning. In her world, gestures like his simply didn't happen without a catch buried somewhere inside them, and she had spent enough years learning to spot the catch that its absence unsettled her more than its presence would have. She turned the ring over in her fingers, watching the light break apart across its facets, and found herself thinking not about the stone at all, but about the man who'd walked in off the street holding something that could have changed his entire life, and had chosen, without hesitation, to hand it back to a stranger instead. Victoria did not sleep that night. She sat in her apartment with the ring back on its chain around her neck and turned the encounter over and over in her mind, looking for the seam, the place where his motive would finally show itself, and never finding it. In her experience, and her experience was extensive, nobody did anything for nothing. Every smile she'd ever received had a price attached to it somewhere, even if it took months to surface. A man had just walked away from $10 million like it was a coupon he'd decided not to use, and it made no sense to her, and the not making sense of it kept her awake until 3 in the morning. By 9 the next day she had her head of security pull together a file. Full name, address, employment history, financials. She told herself it was due diligence. She told herself a lot of things. The report was worse than she expected, in the way that made her chest tighten in a way she didn't have a name for. Behind on rent for 2 months running. A stack of medical bills from an ER visit 18 months back that he was still paying off in $20 increments. A single daughter, 6 years old, enrolled in public school 2 districts over from where they actually lived because the school near their apartment had a reputation her security team's report described, in painfully clinical language, as under-resourced. A man with almost nothing, who had held $10 million in his hand and given it back without so much as taking a business card in return. She read the file twice, then a third time, looking for the thing that would finally make him make sense to her. A criminal record, a pending lawsuit, some hidden angle that would explain away what he'd done as something other than what it plainly was. There was nothing. Just years of steady, unremarkable work. A man who showed up, did his job, went home to his daughter, and quietly drowned a little more each month under bills he had no realistic way of ever fully paying off. It should have made him easy to dismiss. Instead, it made him almost impossible to stop thinking about. She had built her entire adult life around the assumption that everyone, eventually, revealed their price. Marcus Webb had just proven, without even trying to, that the assumption wasn't universal after all, and something about that fact refused to leave her alone. She told her driver to take her there before she'd even fully decided to go. Her car looked absurd parked outside his building, a long, whisper-quiet sedan the color of wet slate, gleaming under a flickering street lamp between a rusted hatchback and a pickup with a cracked windshield. She climbed the stairs because the elevator had an out-of-order sign taped to it that looked like it had been there for years, and knocked on a door with paint peeling at the corners. Marcus opened it in sweatpants and a faded t-shirt, clearly not expecting her, and for a second neither of them said anything. "You're not what I expected," she said finally. "I get that a lot. I need to understand why you did what you did." "There's nothing to understand. I found something that wasn't mine. I gave it back. People don't do that." "Not really. Not when it would change their entire life." He crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe, something tired and a little amused flickering across his face. "Maybe you've just been meeting the wrong people." Before she could answer, a small voice cut through the hallway. "Daddy, who is it?" A little girl appeared at his side in pajamas covered in cartoon stars, peering around his leg with wide, curious eyes fixed entirely on Victoria, taking in the coat, the shoes, the general air of a woman who did not belong in that hallway. "Are you a princess?" Victoria, who had not laughed a genuine laugh in longer than she could remember, felt one catch somewhere in her throat before she managed to swallow it back down. "No, sweetheart. I'm just a lady with a job." "You look like a princess." "Maya," Marcus said, gentle but firm, "let's give the lady some room." But the girl was already tugging at Victoria's sleeve, already asking if she liked pancakes, already deciding, the way 6-year-olds decide things, instantly and completely, that this stranger in the expensive coat was going to be part of her evening. And Marcus, watching Victoria kneel down to Maya's height without a flicker of hesitation, found himself reconsidering, just slightly, the version of her he'd built in his head after their meeting the day before. Somehow the three of them ended up at a diner 2 blocks over, a place with cracked vinyl booths and a menu that hadn't changed prices in what looked like a decade, and Victoria Ashcombe sat across from a man who owed money on a hospital bill and a 6-year-old with syrup on her chin, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for so long she'd forgotten it was possible for it to feel any other way. "Do you have any kids?" Maya asked her, entirely without malice, entirely without any awareness of how the question landed. "No," Victoria said. "I don't." "Do you have a mommy and daddy?" "I did. They're not here anymore." "That's sad." Maya said it simply, the way children say true things, and then went right back to her pancakes without dwelling on it, and Victoria found herself blinking hard at the napkin dispenser for a second before she trusted her voice again. They were halfway through their meal when the bell over the door jingled and Julian walked in, soaked from the rain, coat collar turned up, his eyes finding Victoria's table with the particular speed of a man who'd been tracking her phone. He took in the scene, the cracked booth, the child, the man in the faded shirt, with an expression that made no effort to hide his disgust. "Victoria. What is this?" "Dinner. Here." He said the word like it had a smell to it. "With him?" His eyes landed on Marcus and stayed there, cold and appraising. "I don't know what angle you're running, but I'd suggest you find a new one before it costs you something you can't afford." Marcus set his coffee cup down without hurry. "I don't need your money, and I don't need your permission to eat a meal. You should sit down, or you should leave. Either one's fine with me, but you're scaring the kid." It wasn't loud. It wasn't even particularly sharp. But something about the stillness of it, the complete absence of fear in a man Julian had expected to fold, made Julian's jaw tighten, and for the first time all evening he seemed to run out of things to say. He looked at Victoria, waiting for her to intervene, to apologize, to do any of the small automatic things she usually did to smooth things over. She didn't. She just watched him, arms folded, something unreadable behind her eyes. He left without another word. The bell jingled again on his way out. Maya, who had been quietly finishing her pancakes through the entire exchange, looked up at Victoria with the unbothered curiosity of a child who hadn't fully understood what she'd just witnessed. "Was that your friend?" "No," Victoria said. "Not really. He seemed mad. He gets like that." Marcus caught Victoria's eye across the table, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, the silence settling somewhere between apology and understanding. She didn't owe him an explanation for Julian, and he didn't ask for one, but something had shifted in the booth all the same, some small recalibration neither of them fully had words for yet. The following week, Victoria did something she had never once done in her adult life. She quietly settled someone else's debts without telling them. A shell company, a wire transfer, the back rent gone, the hospital bills paid in full, all of it routed through enough layers that she assumed, wrongly, that it would be untraceable. She told herself it would make things right between them, that it would close some invisible ledger she'd been keeping since the night he walked out of her office. She didn't understand, not yet, that some things can't be paid off, because paying them off was never what they were asking for. Marcus found out 3 days later, when his landlord called to confirm receipt of a payment he hadn't made, and it took him less than an hour to trace it back to its source. He drove to Ashcombe Holdings with the confirmation printed out in his glove box, walked past the same guard who now recognized him and didn't bother trying to stop him, and slammed the paper down on Victoria's glass desk hard enough that she flinched. "I don't want your money. I was trying to help. I know what you were trying to do. You were trying to feel less guilty. That's not the same thing as helping." His voice was low, controlled, but there was an edge in it now that hadn't been there in the diner. "My daughter is not a charity case. I'm not a charity case. You don't get to fix your conscience by writing a check to a man you barely know. I didn't mean. I know exactly what you meant. You've never once had to ask anyone for anything in your whole life, and you can't stand the idea that I did the right thing and didn't ask you for anything either. That's not about me. That's about you." He left the check sitting on her desk and walked out, and this time she didn't reach for a pen. She sat there long after the door closed, staring at the confirmation paper, feeling something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember, which was simply, plainly, ashamed. It took her 4 days to work up the nerve to find him again. She found him in a park 2 neighborhoods over, pushing Maya on a swing that squeaked with every arc, and she stood at the edge of the grass for a long moment before she made herself walk over. "I'm sorry," she said, before he could speak. "I didn't do that to help you. I did it to help myself feel better, and I didn't even realize that until you said it to my face. I've spent my whole life thinking money could fix anything that felt broken, because it was the only tool anyone ever taught me how to use. I don't actually know how to do anything else." Marcus watched her for a long moment, Maya's laughter ringing out behind him as the swing reached its peak. "Everybody wants something from me," Victoria went on, quieter now, her voice losing the polish it usually carried. "My board wants my signature. My fiancé wants my name on his arm and my company under his control. Everyone in every room I walk into wants a piece of something I have. You're the only person who's ever wanted absolutely nothing, and I don't know what to do with that except keep coming back to figure out why." He didn't say anything for a while. Then he nodded toward the empty bench near the swing set. "Sit down. You're making Maya nervous, standing there like you're about to leave." She sat. They spent the whole afternoon in that park, and by the end of it Victoria Ashcombe, who had a standing reservation at the best restaurant in the city, who had never once eaten a meal that cost less than $100 a plate, was sitting on a curb with a $2 ice cream cone melting over her fingers, laughing so hard at something Maya had said that she had to wipe her eyes. It was the first time in years that she could remember laughing without calculating, somewhere in the back of her mind, what it was costing her to be seen laughing. Julian did not take the humiliation at the diner well. He made a series of quiet phone calls to people who owed him favors, the kind of men who ran hotels and knew other men who ran other hotels, and within a week Marcus was informed, without much ceremony, that his services were no longer needed at the Whitfield Grand. No explanation was given. None was needed. Marcus understood exactly what had happened and exactly who had done it, and there was nothing he could point to on paper that would prove it. It didn't stop there. Julian found Marcus outside a corner store 2 days later, waiting by his truck like he'd been standing there for a while, an envelope in his hand. "There's a number in here," Julian said. "Big enough that you'd never have to work another day valeting cars for people who look right through you. All you have to do is take your daughter and go somewhere else. Different city. Different life. Victoria never has to see you again, and you never have to see a hospital bill again either." Marcus looked at the envelope, then at Julian, and something in his expression made the other man's confidence falter, just slightly. "You keep thinking money's the only leverage anybody's got over anybody," Marcus said. "You've never had to live without it, so you don't understand what it does to a man to lose everything and still be standing the next morning. I already know what that feels like. I've already survived it. You're offering me a threat dressed up as an opportunity, and it doesn't scare me, because a man with nothing left to lose is a lot more dangerous than a man with a bank account he's terrified of losing. Keep your envelope. And stay away from my daughter." He got in his truck and drove away, leaving Julian standing on the sidewalk holding an envelope that had just proven completely useless. For a moment, watching him go in the rearview mirror, Marcus felt something close to pity for the man. Julian had built his entire understanding of people around the idea that everyone had a number, a point at which principle gave way to practicality, and he had never once had to test that theory against someone who genuinely didn't. It must have been a strange kind of terrifying, Marcus thought, to meet someone your whole worldview had no explanation for. Julian's next move was quieter and considerably crueler. Within the month, he had used a series of shell purchases to acquire the building Marcus lived in. In 24 hours after the papers cleared, an eviction notice was taped to Marcus's door, citing a legal loophole buried deep in a lease renewal clause nobody had bothered reading closely in years. There was no appeal process fast enough to stop it. Marcus spent that night packing what little they owned into trash bags, folding Maya's clothes with hands that wouldn't quite stop shaking, trying to explain to a 6-year-old why they were leaving in the middle of the night without frightening her more than the situation already warranted. He drove until he found a quiet stretch of curb a few blocks from the park where they'd spent that afternoon with Victoria, and killed the engine, and sat there in the dark with Maya finally asleep in the passenger seat, her head resting against the window, oblivious to how close to the edge her father actually was. Rain started up again, drumming against the windshield in the same rhythm it had the night he'd found the ring, and Marcus hit the steering wheel once, hard, with the heel of his hand, and then sat very still, breathing through his nose, trying to keep the sound of it from waking her. He thought about the envelope Julian had offered him. He thought about how easy it would have been. He thought about whether his pride, the thing he'd built his whole identity around, the thing that had made him walk away from $10 million without blinking, had finally cost his daughter the one thing he'd sworn to always give her, which was safety. He didn't have an answer. He just sat there in the dark, listening to the rain, watching his daughter sleep, wondering if he'd made a mistake he couldn't undo. He thought about the envelope Julian had offered, sitting somewhere in a trash can 2 neighborhoods away where he'd thrown it, and for the first time since that night, he let himself wonder whether refusing it had truly been about principle or whether it had simply been about pride wearing principle's clothes. The line between the two had never felt thinner than it did right now, soaked through, jobless, with nowhere to park for the night that felt permanent or safe. Maya stirred beside him, murmured something in her sleep, and settled again, and the sound of her breathing was the only thing that kept him from unraveling completely. Whatever he had cost them by staying honest, he told himself, he would find some way to make it right. He just didn't know how yet, and not knowing was its own particular kind of exhausting. Victoria found out what had happened almost by accident. Her assistant, cross-referencing an unrelated filing, stumbled across the shell company records and recognized the address immediately, because Victoria had made her memorize it weeks earlier in case she ever needed to reach him quickly. The moment she saw Julian's name buried 3 layers deep in the paperwork, something in her went very quiet and very still, the particular stillness of a person about to become dangerous. She didn't call him. She didn't confront him privately. She waited 3 days, until the night of the annual Ashcombe Foundation Gala, a room full of exactly the kind of people who had spent their whole lives assuming money solved everything, cameras flashing, champagne flowing, Julian standing near the stage in a tuxedo, visibly pleased with himself. Victoria took the microphone earlier than scheduled, skipping the remarks her communications team had drafted for her, and looked directly at the crowd with an expression that made the room go quiet before she'd even said a word. "I was going to talk tonight about the Foundation's plans for the coming year," she said. "Instead, I'm going to talk about something more relevant to the people standing in this room. About a man who bought a building specifically to throw a single father and his 6-year-old daughter out onto the street in the middle of the night, because he was threatened by the fact that someone in his life finally chose honesty over money. That man is standing right there." She didn't need to point. Every head in the room had already turned. "The engagement is off. Effective tonight, he is also removed from this company's board. I built this foundation to help people. I will not stand on this stage next to a man who spends his free time destroying them." The silence that followed was total, broken only by the click of cameras, and Julian stood frozen in the middle of the room with 100 pairs of eyes on him and absolutely nowhere to hide. Victoria left the gala still in her dress, no security trailing her, no driver waiting outside, and drove herself through the rain to the curb where she knew, somehow, exactly where to find him. She knocked on the fogged-up window of his truck, soaked through by the time he rolled it down, mascara running, hair plastered to her face, looking nothing like the woman who commanded boardrooms. "I walked away from all of it," she said, before he could ask. "The company politics. The engagement. The version of my life where everything has a price tag. I walked away because I finally found something worth keeping, and it isn't sitting in a vault somewhere. It's sitting in this truck." Marcus looked at her for a long moment, rain running down both their faces, Maya stirring slightly in her sleep beside him, and then he reached over and unlocked the passenger door. She climbed in. Later, much later, when the storm had passed and the three of them were finally somewhere warm and somewhere safe, none of it would matter the way it had that night, not the money, not the company, not the ring that started the whole thing. What mattered was the sound of Maya's laughter filling a room that finally felt like home, and the quiet, steady certainty that some things, once you find them, are worth walking away from everything else to keep. Years from now, Maya would tell the story of that ring at her own dinner table, to her own children, and it would sound almost like a fairy tale by then, a stranger's diamond, a rainstorm, a man too stubborn to take what wasn't his. But the part she would always linger on longest wasn't the ring at all. It was the image of her father, soaked to the bone, opening a truck door in the dark and letting someone in, not because he had to, but because somewhere along the way he had learned that the family you build with your own 2 hands is worth infinitely more than anything you could ever find lying in the mud.